Hello and welcome to our Art and Architecture series. My name is Kurt DiCamillo, and I have the enormously great privilege of broadcasting to you from a beautiful Jamaica Plain where I live in Boston with a day that I cannot begin to describe. It's almost like summer. God almighty, it's amazing. But to show you, those of you who are not from New England, what New England's really like, so it's 7 degrees now, it's supposed to be 21 degrees tonight. That right there is New England. So let's get back to me. I am the curator of special collections at American Ancestors and the New England Historic Genealogical Society. And in somewhat of a role reversal to what I normally do, I will be your moderator and virtual MC for today's event. American Ancestors is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We're the oldest and largest genealogical society in the world. We specialize in providing resources, research, and expertise that uncover the stories of families, family objects, and family homes. We are pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. Today, we're excited to be partnering with Historic New England, which I have to say, as a sidebar, owns more historic houses in America than any other organization, on the topic of old house do's and don'ts. Historic New England is a nonprofit organization committed to developing a deeper understanding and enjoyment of New England home life by collecting, preserving, and using significant buildings, landscapes, archives, stories, and objects from the past to today. They currently operate 36 historic houses, farms, and mansions across New England, spanning the 17th to the 20th centuries. So if anybody knows how to take care of old homes, it's them. At any point during today's presentation, feel free to type your questions into the question panel. We will answer as many of those as we can at the end of the broadcast. We are broadcasting from our homes to yours with various limitations and distractions, and we apologize in advance if there are any interruptions from our end, and we thank you for your patience. If we do lose connection, you will have access to a full recording on our website. Carissa Demore joined Historic New England in 2013 and was named Team Leader of Preservation Services in 2017. Her experience includes historic preservation advocacy, protecting properties using preservation and conservation easements, and developing a variety of educational programs, workshops, lectures, and tours for preservation students, professionals, and the general public. Carissa has a BS in landscape architecture from Colorado State and a master's degree in historic preservation from the University of Maryland. She previously worked for the City of Annapolis and the L'Enfant Trust in Washington. Without further ado, please welcome Carissa.
Oh, Kurt, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with everybody today, even in this remote form. I wish I could see you all, but it's nice to have a nice big group today to have this conversation. Some of you may know Historic New England because you've accessed our library and archive to research some aspect of life in New England from the 17th century to today. Or maybe you visited one of our public historic sites around the region, like the Gropius House in Lincoln, Massachusetts, or Casey Farm in Saunderstown, Rhode Island, or maybe even Castle Tucker in Wiscasset, Maine. And you've probably seen some of our collection then of over 120,000 objects related to everyday life in New England. If you haven't already, I hope you'll join us for a program about our historic resources sometime soon. Because, full disclosure, through our work, we also hope to inspire good preservation practices beyond our sites and across the region. Within Historic New England, I manage the Preservation Services team, which builds partnerships between Historic New England and preservation-minded folks outside of our organization with the shared goal of protecting historic properties throughout the region. And we do that in a few different ways. We provide legal protections and on-site consultation for 116 privately owned properties around the region through our preservation easement program. We strategically advocate for historic resources that are threatened or need attention. We share technical guidance with our old house owning members over the phone and by email based on Historic New England's 110 years of practical preservation experience. And we also provide educational programs, talks, and field schools about what makes a building or a place worth preserving. And aligned with that last piece, I'm with you today to talk a bit about a preservation approach for caring for old houses. Spring is really the perfect time for this topic because it's the time we all come out of our winter hibernation and start planning projects around the house. So we'll start today by talking about what it means to preserve a place and the different terminology that people use to talk about historic preservation work. We'll also, take a look at how old houses may have changed over time. And I'll give you some guidance on how to successfully add on to an old house and some other ideas for recapturing historic character. And I'll end with some tips on improving energy efficiency in old houses. So we know that all buildings evolve over time. Even if you live in a very well-preserved 17th century saltbox house, you probably have indoor plumbing and some sort of mechanical heating system. Maybe parts have been added or taken away, windows might have moved. Rooms are used differently now than they used to be. So how do you know what to save and what can be altered? What does it mean to preserve? Take the Lyman House in Waltham, where I normally work. This is a house that has seen continuing modifications outside and in over 225 years, which you can see through these images. So when I say Historic New England is preserving this place, what does that mean? Historic preservation is a kind of philosophy about how to treat old buildings. And it's been defined in a variety of ways by different people over the years. In his book, A Building History of Northern New England, Jim Garvin establishes a really good basic preservation philosophy. He says, let the changes you make to your property be additive rather than subtractive in nature. Try to make your work add to the legacy of the past so that you can pass a dwelling of even greater value and comfort to the future. Remember that the number of old houses is finite and it diminishes each year. It is a privilege and a responsibility to own a piece of the past. You can see that kind of additive approach here at Historic New England's Spencer Pierce Little Farm in Newbury, Massachusetts. What you're looking at is a 1690s house, the brick house on the right, and a 1790s Georgian addition on the left, that clapboarded painted piece there. And if you were to go inside this house, you would actually see even further changes through Victorian interiors. So preservation professionals use the National Park Service standard for our preservation philosophy, and it gives us 4 categories for how to treat old buildings: preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, and reconstruction. Preservation is about applying measures necessary to sustain the existing form, integrity, and materials of a historic property. It focuses on the ongoing maintenance and repair of historic materials and features rather than extensive replacement or new construction. Rehab is about making possible a compatible new use for a property through repair or alteration or addition, while preserving the features that convey the historical, cultural, and architectural value of that place. Restoration is the process of accurately depicting a property as it appeared in a particular period of time. That might involve removal of features from other periods. And then finally, reconstruction is about wholesale recreation of a building or a feature that just doesn't exist anymore. Homeowners are usually working with contractors, where it's more typical to use words like preservation, renovation, and remodeling. Preservation, in contractor speak, is the most conservative approach, generally reserved for museums. Restoration is related to that National Park Service definition, removing later features to return a building to something considered original. And I hope you can all hear my air quotes around the word original there. Renovation is most closely related to rehab in the National Park Service terms. That's the adaptation of a building for modern needs. And then remodeling, which is really about a profit-driven approach that has very little concern for historic integrity or significance. At Historic New England, decisions about caring for historic resources are driven by a preservation philosophy that we developed in 2009. It's a bit more instructional than the others, and its guiding principles include researching and documenting resources in order to make informed decisions about preservation and adaptive use of buildings, monitoring historic resources to ensure timely maintenance and repairs that are essential to their long-term preservation, choosing maintenance and repair treatments that prioritize keeping historic material and are reversible whenever possible, meaning they can be removed without damaging the historic fabric. Ensuring that those treatments also acknowledge and preserve the design and craftsmanship that created the historic resource. Sharing what we know with others, just like I'm doing with all of you today, and learning from others by following or improving on national best practices. So Historic New England's goals for our museum sites are probably pretty different from those of a typical homeowner, but this philosophy provides a really solid baseline for museums and private properties to ensure that the decisions are made with longevity of the resource in mind. So let's take a look at a few examples to consider which philosophy is being employed. This is your pop quiz on a Friday. Take this house, for example. You see a historic image on the left and a modern photo on the right. Does this look like preservation, which involves maintenance and repair of historic features, renovation or rehab, which adapts the property to modern needs while retaining its historic character, or remodeling, which discards historic character in favor of standard commercial materials and methods? In this case, this is remodeling. The historic house has really been sterilized through things like the addition of vinyl windows, a standard commercially available entry porch. Its historic fabric and character are lost, even though the house is still present. So how about in another example? Are we looking at preservation, renovation or rehab, or remodeling? This is also remodeling, not preservation, even though the house looks more historic than it used to. If you compare the current image on the right to the older one on the left, you can see the changes to windows at the front and the L off the back, the new door surround, the addition of corner pilasters, and the big addition off the back that looks kind of like a barn. This is what I call a Folonial revival. These aren't honest historic features for this house. There's no evidence that this house ever looked anything like this. So let's look at another. How about in this case, preservation, rehab, or remodel? This is an example of rehabbing. This owner has opened up the historic porch and enlarged an addition at the right side to accommodate their needs, but they've clearly retained the historic character of the original house. So the truth is, most old houses are either rehabbed or remodeled. Here are a couple more examples of efforts that are trying to improve an old house and make it look more interesting, but neither of them is preserving the character of the old house. On the left, it's a remodel that's just trying to make it look more appealing. And on the right, you're looking at a mid-century ranch house and efforts to make it look more like a craftsman bungalow. So before you make changes to a house, let's talk a little bit about how to look at an old house and start to read the changes that may have already happened. One of the most common ways that old houses have changed is by getting larger. So for instance, the asymmetry in this front facade was a clue that this house wasn't all constructed at the same time. And we actually confirmed that it had been expanded by looking at the sheathing boards at the roof, which you can see really nicely here as they replace the roof. The earlier house is the part on the right, which has those vertical sheathing boards. Later, the house was expanded past the front door to include the additional 4 windows and those horizontal sheathing boards on the left. So what you're looking at is basically an 18th century rehab project. The book A Field Guide to Old Houses by Virginia McAllister is actually a great tool for understanding the architectural style or styles of your house. Start by looking at the form of your house as a first clue to its age, then look at the fenestration and other details. because porches and windows are often used to update an older house. Such as in this case, we've got a colonial revival porch that has been added on to an earlier Italianate house. But the 2/2 windows you're seeing here could actually be original. Roof lines and chimneys also change over time to allow more living space. So for example, knowing that mansard roofs were easy to add helps you see the federal period house beneath. In this case, the owner actually chose to restore this house, another term, to its earlier Georgian configuration by removing a mansard roof that you can see in that older image on the left. They also removed some shutters and an entry porch that were added in the 19th century to the original 18th century Georgian house. So just like in the past, owners today often want to expand their house. And we see common issues with this. They might include things like what you're seeing here. We call this radical remodeling. It's easy to see how the addition on the left of this house went wrong. It doesn't respect the scale and the vocabulary of the historic house. It doesn't consider the massing and proportions of the historic house. These are really two completely distinct ideas jammed together, and they're arguing with each other. The new addition doesn't add anything compatible to the story that the old house is telling. Another common issue that we see is pushing the envelope without respecting the scale, massing, and form of the original house. Here, they've expanded the original Cape Cod style house in literally every direction. And we also see issues with split personalities. So in this case, does the right hand know what the left hand is doing? So when you're adding on to an old house, think small and simplify. A really good rule of thumb is to live with your new old house for a while before starting a large construction project. It's new to you, but it's not new to the world. Keep your additions also within the allowable zoning envelope wherever you can. Design so you don't need a variance or other special permits. What you want to do is look for a design that is compatible with your old house in terms of massing, size, scale, and architectural features. A preservation goal is always to minimize the loss of historic fabric and minimize changes to the primary facades of your house. The goal is that an addition be clearly differentiated from the historic building. Preservationists also like to use this term subordinate. You don't want an addition to distract from the historic house. It's the most important part. A simple form with a lower ridgeline than the house, a smaller footprint, and keeping wall planes of the addition set back from the wall planes of the house, or even connected via a hyphen, will all help to accomplish these things. The goal is a seamless addition to the old house based on the original design. So material compatibility is also important, as is fenestration, the locations of doors and windows. You're looking for compatible size, character, and rhythm to the existing house. And in thinking about these things, we have to think about code compliance. When it comes to building code compliance, historic buildings actually often receive special consideration depending on the state and the municipality where you live. It's worth reading the code, painful as that may sound, and talking with your local building inspector to find out. Don't assume that your historic building has to conform to the same code requirements as new construction. For example, don't assume that you have to remove features for building code compliance. Porches like this one in this photo that are less than 18 inches off grade may not need railings. You may not have to pull it down. Also, see if you can augment rather than replace to accomplish code compliance, like adding an extra railing on a non-compliant porch, for example. And this is a public library where the handrails on the stair had to be a certain height according to the code. So rather than replace this great historic railing, they were able to sensitively add a new handrail above the old one, which you can barely see, but it's there. So you might have also noticed with some of these examples that paint is a great way to recapture historic character in an old house. This could really be an entire separate lecture topic, but as a general rule of thumb, for many New England houses, a 3-color paint scheme was the norm. There's a body color, and you can see here there's primer on the lower level of this image, but that kind of taupe body color above. Sash, shutters, and doors are generally one color. It's dark in this photo. And then trim is that lighter beige color. That covers everything else, really, everything else on the building. If your house was sided with vinyl or aluminum at some point, removing it is another great way to recapture historic character. And if you want an idea of what your house might look like without the siding, look at similar types of houses in your neighborhood. Seeing a well-preserved Italianate, like you're looking at in the upper right photo here, helps you see what's been removed in the one that's sided in the lower left. Old houses that have been sided generally retain their original clapboards or shingles beneath the newer siding. So evidence of original trim starts to show up where it's been removed. And the best source for what your house looked like originally is your own house, minus the siding. Removing siding will likely expose some issues that will need to be repaired, though. Installing aluminum or vinyl siding damages historic fabric when furring strips and siding components are nailed to the building. Siding is also sometimes applied by owners as a quick way of covering underlying issues, like a drainage problem on the roof. So you might discover some of those old lurking problems. The siding installation process also requires that the existing surface be flat and free of any obstructions so that the new siding will be smooth and even in appearance. To achieve that requisite flat surface, some details may be removed or cut back. As you can see in the upper left picture here, there's a profile of a historic window hood that remains in the paint. And a good carpenter can actually use this profile to recreate that feature. So just because it's gone doesn't mean all hope is lost for you as the historic homeowner. You can also see in the lower image where shutters used to be installed. That appears when the siding is removed, and those could also be restored. And they've even uncovered a small door at the back addition that was just hiding under the siding. So many trim elements can actually be replaced with stock moldings or some simple carpentry. Millwork companies often stock a wide variety of molding patterns and details that may match elements from your house or could be reasonable approximations of traditional trim. That includes molding for porches, windows, doors, and roof lines. And this probably raises an important question about substitute materials at historic houses. I hear about this a fair amount. Synthetic alternatives exist and new options appear frequently for every aspect of the building: vinyl windows and siding, permastone cladding, decorative architectural shingles. In most cases, we don't recommend replacing traditional materials with these modern, no maintenance, air quotes, alternatives. As a homeowner, we would suggest you start by weighing a few considerations about your existing house. What's the significance of the building or the feature that you're thinking about replacing? Is this something on the main house, or is it something on a smaller garden shed? What's the significance of the element itself? Is it a simple stair riser, or are you talking about an intricately carved railing? Is this element really prominent on the front facade, or is it tucked into a back or a side elevation? Is the original deteriorated beyond reasonable repair? A lot of things can be repaired. And how much really needs to be replaced? Then take a look at the substitute material that you might be thinking about. And will that material look and feel the same as the historic material? That means considering things like color, texture, sheen, and thinking about it not just when you install, but also when it deteriorates over time. Think also about what maintenance is required for that substitute. Does it need to be painted? And can it be repaired? For example, if you install a PVC fence and it gets plowed by a snowplow, as happens in New England, are you going to be able to repair it? Along with that, what's the cost to install it, to maintain it, to replace it? And how do the life cycle costs compare to that traditional material? And then finally, how will the synthetic material impact the surrounding fabric? So do you have specifications that talk about moisture penetration? Is this material going to expand and contract differently than a historic material? And is it going to create some sort of reversibility problem? Can you remove it in the event that you decide it's not working? And last but not least, think about the weight of the material as well. We've noticed in recent years some challenges around things like cementitious siding as a replacement for wood siding because it's so much heavier. So like I said, very often we find traditional materials to be superior to substitutes when we weigh all of these different factors. One exception we've found, though, is with historic wood gutters. Because they're constantly exposed to weather and water, most wood gutters have been replaced more than once in their history on a building. And new wood just isn't as durable as it used to be. Plus, the intensity of rainstorms in New England is increasing. When it rains, more water is coming down in shorter periods of time, which often overflows traditional wood gutter profiles. So when it comes to wood gutters, we actually frequently suggest that homeowners consider options for installing a copper or a fiberglass gutter that replicates the historic profile. That's what you can see in the middle two examples of this photo. There's a traditional wood gutter on the left, and on the right, that's more of an aluminum case style gutter, which is not what we're talking about. When you look at these substitute materials from the ground, they don't typically detract from the historic character of a house, and they may be significantly better in terms of drainage capacity and longevity. So they may be an appropriate example. So lastly, let's talk for a little bit about energy efficiency and older houses. As we leave winter behind us, this is a wonderful time to start thinking about what to do to prepare for next year. Improving the efficiency of New England houses isn't a new idea. Chopping wood and shoveling coal are hard work. So people have been pursuing ways to reduce their energy consumption for as long as houses were being built. Early New England homes faced south to take advantage of solar gain. Brick nogging and eelgrass were used as insulating materials. Ceilings were kept low to keep heat closer to occupants, and shutters kept hot sun out in the day and warm air in at night. In the 19th century, double-hung sash allowed for air circulation. You could open the top and the bottom to create kind of a convection current in the summer. And later casement windows allowed even more airflow. Likewise, radiators were positioned beneath windows to create convection airflow in the wintertime. Sash locks were used to keep windows tightly closed and seal out drafts, and heavy drapes and rugs insulated, and doors could be closed to keep in the heat. And porches shielded windows from high summer sun and allowed people to live outside warm houses in the summertime. And we're really lucky because New England still has a lot of old houses. Between 21 and 31% of housing stock in New England is over 80 years old. So it's worth thinking about how we as a region can continue to increase the energy efficiency of old houses. And aside from any larger environmental or climate impacts, it could save you some money and it could make you more comfortable in your home. So energy efficiency upgrades that tend to get the most attention also tend to be the most cutting edge and the most invasive. These are often marketed as deep energy retrofits. In preservation terms, deep energy retrofits involve subjecting older and potentially historic homes to an unwarranted and unjustified level of experimentation in terms of current levels of expertise in three areas: the materials science, the building technology, and the construction trades. More costly, more complex, and less well-tested energy interventions, things like wrapping a house with several layers of rigid foam insulation and installing geothermal heating plants, are likely to be too expensive, too invasive, and too prone to failure for the majority of our existing housing stock. The standard deep energy retrofit, which includes conditioning the entire interior volume of the structure from basement to attic, is a complex, demanding, and intricate process that integrates meticulous air sealing, comprehensive control of moisture in the building envelope, and active management of heating and ventilation systems. So it really presumes a high level of expertise on the part of designers and installers of these systems. and it also includes a substantial loss of historic materials and finishes. So dramatic reductions in energy consumption can absolutely be achieved. These retrofits may have more moving parts, though, than an old house can be expected to handle. They're designed with new construction in mind, and they're just not a good fit with old houses that have moved, shifted, settled, sagged, and generally been mucked around with many times already. We really need more information, more research on the building materials side, a better understanding of historic methods and practices on the building technology side, and more training and specialized knowledge on the building trades side. Until then, the best advice for older houses is to keep energy interventions to a more basic level, one that respects the core principle of preservation, reversibility, and proceeds slowly. If we can concentrate on enhancing energy performance in newer houses, we will develop the expertise needed to safely, successfully, efficiently, and economically implement those strategies in older and historic houses over time. The good news is that doesn't mean there are plenty of things that can and should be done in any house, regardless of its age or its historical significance, to make it less of an energy consumer. And they're likely to be less expensive and less stressful for you to implement. I like to think of this approach as picking the low-hanging fruit, or the shallow energy retrofit. This is what we did as a comprehensive energy retrofit at the Lyman Estate, which is owned by Historic New England in Waltham, and as I mentioned earlier, is where I usually work. This house was designed in 1793 by Samuel McIntyre, and it has seen a variety of changes over time, especially in the late 1800s and around 1917. The Lyman Estate is not a museum property, but it's actively used for offices and for functions rentals. The shallow energy retrofit approach that we used was designed to be completely consistent with our preservation philosophy, including focusing on solutions that are reversible or minimally harm the architectural fabric in the house. And this effort reduced energy consumption in our 14,000 square foot mansion by 47%, using all of the steps listed on this slide, including repairing and rehabbing over 100 historic wood single glazed windows and adding weather stripping and new storm windows, and converting the oil heating system to a high efficiency natural gas system. So let's talk a little bit more about this. Our project began with a comprehensive energy audit of the building to identify areas to concentrate our weatherization efforts. And we also looked at how much oil we were using each year and how much electricity, so we could have accurate figures to compare with our results. We carefully insulated the conditioned space of the house from the unconditioned third floor and attic, and we sealed gaps with lots of foam. For homeowners insulating attic floors, bats, rigid foam, and blown-in cellulose are all good reversible options for insulating your attic floor. Insulating your basement can be more complicated because the heating plant is often down there, as is the case at the Lyman Estate. And there's also generally bigger moisture issues in basements. So the most valuable area to insulate is at the sill or the rim joist and around any penetrations, things like utility connections or ducts. Historic wood windows are a better product than any replacement option because they're built to be repaired so they can last and last. Wood windows do need maintenance. They're going to need paint, glazing, putty, sometimes some carpentry repairs or general tightening up. And you can enhance their efficiency with weather stripping and consider adding storm windows. There are a lot of studies that show that retaining a historic wooden window and adding a good quality storm window gives equal energy efficiency performance to a double glazed replacement sash. Whatever you may be told, know that introducing insulation into the walls of an old house is complicated. You may have active older wiring in walls, and retrofitting them with insulation can be a bit of a fire hazard. And you may also develop some potential moisture issues. So a colleague of mine spotted this Greek Revival house in Connecticut several years ago. And whatever wall insulation was added to this house, it is now harboring so much moisture that the entire framing structure of the house can be read in the mildew patterns on the outside walls. This is what preservationists fear. This is probably a 1970s oil crisis insulation job run amok. And 40 years later, the house is well on the way to ruin and certainly unlikely to be a healthy interior environment for its occupants. Poorly done wall insulation is also the culprit at these buildings, where paint is sheeting off the walls that are insulated. These days, blown in or dense pack wall insulation done properly doesn't have to result in these kinds of moisture problems. But managing moisture in houses where you're breathing and cooking and showering is a complicated piece of building science, and it's much easier to manage when you have full access to the wall cavities. But for most historic houses, that involves removing all of the clapboards and sheathing or all of the plaster and woodwork. And at that point, as a homeowner, you have to consider whether it's worth it. Which brings me back to my earlier point. It takes a really long time to learn whether complicated building interventions will be successful in older houses. Increased energy efficiency is absolutely possible with older homes. And remember that we cut our energy usage in half at the Lyman Estate. But if you want to ensure that your house stands the test of time, there are some key principles to keep in mind. First off, treat old houses very gently. Focus more invasive interventions on newer houses. Stick with simpler and reversible interventions, and beware of overcomplex solutions, the one-size-fits-all and no maintenance solutions that are just too good to be true. And I'll end today with one final tip, and that is, when in doubt, seek help from others. Historic New England is always happy to share our expertise on old house care. Like Kurt said, we have a lot of these, and we've learned a lot of things over the years. We have a number of resources on our website, including a variety of white papers on maintenance topics, if you really want to take a deep dive into how these things can be done. We also offer personal consultations over the phone or email through our homeowner services, which is a benefit to our members. And if you're really scratching your head about a particularly tricky situation at your house, definitely consider these options and reach out. Kurt, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Krista. That was fantastic. And I have to say, it just reminds me more of how wonderful we are to be able to live in New England. Right now, if you have questions, type them into that panel, and we will answer as many of them as we can in the time we've got left. I'm going to start off with the first question, which is something that's come up a number of times. What are some key resources that you could recommend for people who want to research the history of a historic house? Basic to-do things, what not to do, if there's a book on Amazon or something like that that might be available.
Absolutely. There are a number of great books, and I think there will be some of those coming out at the end of this panel that give some overview. But in addition to that, in terms of things that you can look at to understand your old house, there's some great local resources that you should try to access. Things like your local historical society or your local history room of your public library may have good information about your house in particular. Likewise, contact your state historic preservation office. There's one in every state, and they are the place where all kinds of survey forms and National Register nominations are kept about old houses all over the state. So they may have research materials related to your old house. Files at the local building department are really great, useful resource for understanding more recent history. And if you're wondering what somebody did, especially during the 20th century, going and asking to take a look at the building file for your house is a good idea. And then there are lots of other records that are maybe similar in kind of research to genealogy research. Changes in a property often coincide with changes in ownership or marriage or deaths in a family. So looking at things like census records and city directories are useful. Tax assessment records and deeds for a property can also begin to give you an idea about changes in use or size or property boundaries. And it's great to compare those also with historic maps. And there are lots of great online sources to uncover historic maps for wherever you are.
Wow, That was a lovely comprehensive answer. Thank you.
It was a lot in a short time, but.
Catherine asked, what is meant by air seal in an attic?
Yes, yes. I'm sorry for that jargon. Air sealing basically just means sealing up gaps. So there are all sorts of spaces where building materials come together. Think where your flooring meets your baseboard. There's a little gap between those two materials. And air sealing is the process of taking something like foam, backer rod, or caulk and sealing those gaps so that you stop the airflow.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. And I have a question here from Joe who says, what do you suggest about a house with asbestos shingles?
Oh, that's a good question. That depends a little bit on your preservation philosophy. So I will tell you, we struggled with this at Historic New England because we tend to take a very conservative approach with our museum sites. You know, we're very careful to try and stay absolutely within the preservation wording of the National Park Service preservation philosophy, meaning that we keep everything. But we had a historic barn that had asbestos siding put on it in the early 20th century, and that was done to make it more fireproof. And we realized that we needed to make repairs to that building, and being a public site, we also didn't want asbestos shingles right in the public interface. And so we have a lot of debate about how to recreate the size and the texture of those asbestos shingles. I'm hoping that as a homeowner, you won't put yourself through the same level of strain to try to recreate your asbestos shingles. I think in a lot of cases, there are reasonable either asphalt shingles available now, or potentially if you wanted to look at slate shingles, a lot of times asbestos roofs are meant to recreate the appearance of slate. Asbestos and asphalt shingles are actually a substitute material of the early 20th century, meant to be a sort of cheaper, more durable alternative to those more traditional materials.
I think that slate is wonderful, but my understanding is that it's not inexpensive. Could you expand a little on that? Because I've heard a number of friends of mine who've been required by historic districts to replace their roof with a slate roof. Sometimes from the same slate mines in Wales where it was taken from in the 19th century. So, could you just tell us more about slate? Because the other thing I think people may not realize is that slate comes in many colors.
Yes, yes. So slate is one of those things that more often than not, it's a preservation approach that I would recommend. If you have a slate roof, a lot of times maintenance work can preserve that slate roof without having to do wholesale replacement. Installing a completely new slate roof is an expensive undertaking, and it's really best if you want to think about the longevity of that roof. A slate roof properly installed is going to last, 100 years or more. If that's not something that you want to do, though, if it's cost prohibitive, then asphalt is a great way to go. And looking at architectural asphalt shingles or just regular 3-tab asphalt shingles in a nice neutral dark gray color is, in a lot of cases, a good approach to approximate that slate appearance.
Lovely, thank you. We've had a number of people who have asked for the details of the Virginia McAllister book. If you could possibly repeat that, and I think it's still in print. I'm not sure if that's true or not. I know my copies were done in like 1960s, I think.
Exactly. There are a number of different editions, and actually, if you end up with a newer edition, preservationists the world over will covet it because we're all lugging around older versions that have been very dog-eared. But it is a field guide to American houses by Virginia McAllister. And you can absolutely get it on Amazon or in most used bookstores.
And the other thing that's interesting, I think, is that we have, it's funny because historic houses in America are oftentimes very differently treated than those in foreign countries. The ones that I'm most familiar with, of course, are in the United Kingdom. And in those countries, you get a listed status, which means that your building is legally protected. How do you get a historic designation in the United States for your house?
Oh, yes, yes. So this is an interesting question. So there are lots of different types of designations in the US. The most sort of commonly referenced one is to have a building listed on the National Register of Historic Places, or to have a building that is within a National Register district. And that means that it's been recognized by the state and by the National Park Service as being significant for its architectural character or its association with old historic events or with important people. And so there's a register of these great old places. And you may find a good amount of historic information if your building is listed on the National Register and you pull up the form that's been submitted to have it listed. Going through the process of listing a building these days on the National Register is also a really great way of pulling together all of that information. You'll have to go through some social history, some architectural history, really pulling together all of the resources. And it can be a nice way for a homeowner to understand what's significant about their property so that they can make informed decisions about changes in the future. That said, listing on the National Register does not provide your house really with any meaningful protection. It's largely an honorific kind of a thing. The only point at which National Register listing could save your old house is if there is a federal project that's threatening it. If someone wanted to put a highway through your house, then the National Register would perhaps help to save it. But for most day-to-day things, anyone could come and knock down a house listed on the National Register, which is why we also have local historic districts in a lot of communities, which allows the local government to protect the exterior of a property. They can protect everything that is visible from a public way at that point. The other option is a preservation easement or preservation restriction. And that is a private legal agreement that is generally between the property owner and a qualified historic preservation organization like Historic New England. And that's what I was talking about with those 116 houses at the very beginning of my talk, where we have the ability to ensure that properties are preserved. We can protect their entire exterior, make sure that changes to the exterior are reviewed and approved by us before they're made. We have the right to review new buildings or new additions to those properties, and we can also protect interior features. So preservation easements are a really strong tool for protecting historic buildings. They're kind of the strongest tool that exists in the United States, and in some ways the closest to some of the international preservation protections that exist in other ways.
Do you happen to know if the Department of the Interior maintains on their website a listing of every building that's on the National Register?
They have digitized the majority of their files at this point. It's been a long effort to get all of the National Register records from paper listing onto their web platform. And the last I heard, they were close or finished with that project. The biggest challenge for us was that they put the states with the largest number of listed buildings last in the queue. So we've been waiting forever for the Massachusetts properties to arrive. But they are there now, and you should be able to find them through the Park Service. Yes.
That's a great resource. A number of people have asked how the airflow works when you put a radiator beneath a window. How that works, what the purpose is, and how I guess it circulates the air.
Exactly. It touches a little bit on kind of high school physics, where warm air rises, cool air falls. So if you put a radiator underneath the window, the warm air from that radiator rises up and then cools off because the window surface is cooler. And as it gets toward the ceiling, then that cool air falls and is heated by the radiator, which is close to the floor, and rises again. And so it creates that kind of circular air current.
Lovely. I think the last question we'll ask is someone with a Victorian who wants to know where they can find appropriate handrails to provide safety in the stairs compatible with its Victorian structure.
Oh, that's a great question. It depends a little bit on where you are, but in a lot of cases, if you can find a local ironworks, to craft something for you, or if you can find your local Millworks site. There's a great place in Somerville here. JP Moriarty is a great millworks shop that could help with a project like that, or DeAngelis Ironworks, which is just south of Boston, are both great resources if you're in this area. But if you're not, if you're looking for any kind of contractor recommendation outside of the Boston metro area, a great resource for that is your statewide historic preservation organization. So every state has a statewide organization: Preservation Massachusetts in Massachusetts, Preservation Connecticut in Connecticut, and so forth. And those organizations generally keep a database on their website of contractors who specialize in historic preservation and know old houses. So it can be everything from architects to carpenters to ironworks to what have you. And those are really great starting points to find someone who will be able to help.
Thank you. I lied, because there's another important question that's popped up. How can somebody who has a historic house get a consultation with you or somebody else at Historic New England?
Sure. So you'll see an email address, I think, in the follow-up to this lecture, but you can contact us directly at easements, EASEMENTS, at historicnewengland.org. You can also sign up with us as a member, and we will contact you at that point. So options.
And that's a wonderful segue, because we want to encourage everybody to join Historic New England. It's a very reasonable annual fee and gets you connected with some of the most amazing structures in this incredible part of the country that we live in. That is all the time we have today for questions. You can email us questions if you have any others at heritagetours@nehgs.org, which you see up on your screen right now. And you also see up on your screen upcoming stuff. So I will be hosting, as I did today on March 26th, a video tour of Tissington Hall in Derbyshire with my friend Oliver Garrish, who is an English architectural historian. I will be in conversation with the author Stellene Volandis, who wrote a book last year called Jewels That Made History, 101 Stone Myths and Legend. And then on April 16th, I will be giving one of my lectures on historic Scottish houses. So we hope you can tune in for those. And as always, you can find information about all of our offerings at americanancestors.org/education/online-classes. Thank you again for joining us today. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of members and of friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to keep these programs free and to create more programs for you and others to enjoy. And if you'd like to learn more about American Ancestors and our fabulous heritage tours, some of which I lead, you can visit americanancestors.org/heritage-tours. Thank you again to Clarissa. Please stay safe, stay healthy. I hope to see you again at an online program in the future. Goodbye for now.